thanks, Matt and the team. Matt, you must be operating on fumes. I know that's not a very sustainable thing to say, but
no,
well done. Really great event.
Yeah, it's a little that way. I've gotten a little bit of sleep here and there, but like not for an extended period of time, for a few weeks now at least, putting this together. And so I hope it makes a lot of good connections, and we're live streaming, to some various networks, and so I'll let you start your presentation and take it away, please. Thank you.
Okay. Am I sharing screen? Can you see it?
Yes, you are. It's a full screen and a CO2 echo. Yep.
Yep. Okay. Well, thanks, Matt. Right. So I'm David Jones, and I'm going to give a really speedy run through of the voluntary carbon markets. And forgive me, look, if I cover some stuff you already know, but I want to try and tell a story of why the carbon markets are a great investment opportunity. I co-founded CO2 Eco about 18 months ago to drive nature-based investments at scale. And that's by leveraging long-term contract structures for carbon removals, and also to leverage the value of nature in those structures. And we found the market pretty challenging. It has to be said. I'm sure many of you will know, have opinions on why that is. Let's run through why those markets behave as they are. And perhaps I'll pose a question at the end about what we might do about it, which may come up, provoke the questions in the Q&A. So let me just work out how to scroll down. Oops, too far. So look, we all know global emissions are continuing to rise despite all the commitments. 1.5 degrees is pretty difficult to achieve now. I mean, the IPCC say it's pretty much impossible. Julio said just now, we need to target absolute zero. And that's absolutely right. But you can see, if we'd started that a few years ago, we would have had an easier job looking at that light blue line. Now we're stuck with the practically impossible position of a dark blue line. It can't be done, okay? Realistically, it cannot be done. To achieve 1.5 degrees by just reducing emissions. We need to also invest in carbon removals at scale. And there are two ways of doing it. You can wait for the tech to arrive with direct air capture and so on, or you can rely on and invest in photosynthesis and the nature solutions that Janja said earlier, that nature does the hard work for us. And natural solutions are proven and the best solution, not just for the built environment, but for, as Janja said, but for removals generally across the economy. The transition to net zero requires huge and urgent increase in investment. Now, this unpleasantly green graph from Bloomberg just illustrates beautifully. And this is just this week they published this. It illustrates beautifully what a huge task we have on our hands, but also, of course, what a great opportunity across all sectors of society and our economy, but also the restoration of nature and the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. By the way, look, 8 trillion, which is kind of what, between 6 and 8 trillion, Bloomberg are projecting that we really ought to be investing any minute now, as soon as possible. That equates to around about 8% of global GDP. Now that you could look at that as a huge amount, and you could also say only 8%. That's it's not completely turning society and the economy on its head. It is a transition rather than changing everything. But what is going to unleash this new investment? Government and international regulation and market regulation is clearly necessary. Taxes and bans on things like combustion engines and gas boilers in Germany this week, all good stuff. Compliance markets using cap and trade mechanism, all good stuff. But we also need to leverage private voluntary capital, spotting this huge potential investment as an opportunity by cost reduction, risk mitigation, supply chain efficiencies, carbon reductions and carbon removals. Let's just think about, how carbon credits can contribute to this element in the voluntary carbon market. And there's a big difference between the reasons to invest in avoidance credits and removals credits. Removals credits, the area at the bottom of the graph here between a company's emissions reduction target and its achievement of net zero and beyond to net carbon removals. Carbon removals bridge that gap between their ability to reduce emissions and net zero. And yes, it would be lovely if we could reduce emissions down to zero, but we need to go beyond that. So removals credits are essential in order to, and an essential market mechanism in order to enable this to happen. But I would pose the question, why would, if we're back at 2023 today on this graph, why invest now in, why would a company invest now in removals when, they've made their commitment to be net zero by 2050? I'll just wait till 2050 to start. And the reason is we need the investment to be driven now. We can't wait and expect the supply to be there when they need it. So there is a market to do that now. And of course, a lot of nature-based services require the investment, and so a decade or two, like afforestation, to build up the removals anyway. So investment is needed now in order to deliver the supply in the future. Avoidance and reduction credits, on the other hand, they're effectively admitting that you can't hit your emissions reduction targets. And in practice, it would be better for those corporates to invest capital in achieving those emissions reductions rather than spending money on avoidance carbon credits like REDD+. But you have to admit that the funding of credits such as REDD+ and avoiding deforestation does achieve good things. So it's kind of super voluntary in a way. Go beyond. Yes, you've got to make direct investments in emissions reduction in your supply chain, but go beyond that and spend money on reduction and avoidance anyway. That's the kind of message of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But it's a tough way to sort of justify an investment. Yeah, so it's not a real market opportunity in the sense of creating a voluntary market, whereas removals credits are, but they depend on governments and corporations making firm contractual commitments to achieve net zero, ideally sooner than 2050, and to go beyond to net removals below the curve. A very quick expose of the Oxford offsetting principles. These are currently the accepted definitive definition of avoidance and reduction removal credits, and you can see the examples along the bottom where avoidance, could be reducing livestock and methane emissions, could be reducing the rates of Amazonian deforestation, and under number 3 there at the bottom in the middle, combined carbon capture and storage. That's out of the tailpipes of cement works and steel works and so on. And then into removals, the blue blocks, planting trees, restoring wetlands, relatively short-lived storage, and then as yet economically and potentially technically unproven methodologies to get long-lived stories of carbon removals. Now we need to do all of these, the old everything all at once sprays, yeah. But we need the markets to value this. And the markets are pretty small. I mean, this slide shows, and again, this is Boston Consulting Group analysis of 2015 to 2021 combined investments in voluntary carbon. markets. You can see the green bar is avoidance credits, and there's relatively small figures at the bottom of the removals credits. And bearing in mind that the total avoidance credits are less than 100 million tons in 7 years. Yeah, that's the equivalent of an annual carbon emissions of 5 million US citizens. So it's pretty insignificant. Okay. And we've got an awful lot to do. So a couple of closing thoughts. Yeah, the carbon markets are developing fast. There's a lack of trust. That's preventing investment. We could really do with global agreements and taxonomies and so on to help improve that trust. Investments in removals need market-based justification, and we just have to have those net zero firm contractual commitments by corporates and governments. And that will enable then the development of standardized financial instruments. Long term, as I mentioned earlier, is absolutely essential. We need to invest now in order to deliver the supply for the 10, 20, 30 years time. And the more permanent, the better. And a question is around the future carbon curve. Some commentators believe it's a bell curve. But if so, what's the shape and what's the timing of that curve? And how high will it go? So I'll pose a question for the breakout or the Q&A, depending on how Matt wants to play it. Why would corporates invest today in nature-based carbon removals when their feet are not being held to the fire, either by regulation or by the market for doing so? Thanks.
Thank you, David. So I think